"Very well, my lord." 4 words. That was all Anne Remington said when her husband handed her the separation papers and pointed toward the door. No tears, no argument, no begging. Arthur Remington thought he was solving a problem. He thought removing his wife would restore order to his household. He was wrong. Because the morning after Anne walked out, he woke up to something he had never experienced in 15 years of marriage. His entire world had stopped breathing. If you've ever been the woman holding everything together while someone refused to see it, subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. The separation papers had been signed on a Thursday. Arthur Remington remembered that detail because Thursdays were the days Anne reviewed the household accounts. She would sit at the small writing desk in the east study, the one with the cracked leather chair she refused to replace, despite his repeated offers of a finer one, and she would go through every ledger, every invoice, every expenditure note, with the careful attention of a woman who understood that the difference between a thriving estate and a failing one lived in the details most people ignored. He had walked past that desk 100 times without stopping. He stopped that Thursday. He placed this document on top of her open ledger. Anne looked up at him. Her eyes moved from his face to the paper. She did not reach for it immediately. She simply looked at it the way a woman looks at something she has been expecting for a long time, not with surprise, but with a quiet, terrible recognition. Then she picked it up. She read it slowly. Every line. Her expression did not change. When she finished, she folded it along its original crease precisely carefully, the way she did everything, and she set it down beside the ledger. "Very well, my lord." That was all. Arthur had prepared himself for tears. He had steeled himself against arguments, against pleading, against the kind of scene that Eleanor Whitmore had warned him Anne might create. Eleanor had said in her soft and persuasive voice that women like Anne, women who had grown too comfortable in their authority, did not release that authority without a fight. But Anne did not fight. She rose from the chair. She straightened her dress. And she walked out of the east study without looking back at him once. Arthur stood there for a moment, waiting for something. He wasn't certain what. An outburst. A slammed door. Any evidence that she had felt the weight of what he had just done. The door closed behind her with barely a sound. He told himself the quiet was a relief. That night, the house was still. Not the comfortable stillness of a well-run household settling into evening, but something different, something with an edge to it that Arthur couldn't quite name. He dismissed it, poured himself a glass of brandy in the drawing room, and spent an hour reading without retaining a single word. He went to bed and slept without difficulty. I was certain, in the way that proud men are certain of things they have not thought through, that he had made the right decision. The next morning, Arthur Remington woke to silence. Not the gentle silence of early morning before the household stirred. The full silence. The wrong silence. He lay still for a moment, waiting for the sounds that had accompanied every morning of his adult life at Remington Hall. The soft knock of Mrs. Hadley bringing the morning tray. The distant sound of fires being laid in the downstairs rooms. The low voices of the kitchen staff beginning their preparations. The creak of the back stairs as the housemaids began their rounds. Nothing. He waited. Still nothing. Arthur sat up. The fire in his bedchamber had not been laid. The room held the night's cold. He reached for the bell pull beside the bed and rang it. He waited. No one came. He rang it again, harder this time, with the particular force of a man unaccustomed to being kept waiting. Then he dressed himself imperfectly, without assistance, fumbling with buttons that had been fastened for him every morning for as long as he could remember, and he walked out into the corridor. The corridor was empty. He walked to the top of the staircase and looked down into the entrance hall. Empty. "Hello?" His voice echoed off the stone walls in a way it never had before. The house swallowed it whole and gave nothing back. Arthur descended the stairs slowly, one hand on the banister, the peculiar sensation growing in his chest with each step. He was not a man given to anxiety. He was Arthur Remington of Remington Hall, a man whose name commanded respect across 3 counties, whose invitation was sought by every family of standing within 50 miles. He was not the sort of man who felt afraid in his own home. And yet, he pushed open the door to the morning room. Empty. The table was not set. The curtains had not been drawn. The silver that should have been polished and arranged on the sideboard sat where it had been left the previous evening, dulled and untouched. He pushed open the door to the kitchen. Empty. The hearth was cold. The bread that should have been baked before dawn had not been started. The kitchen, the beating heart of a house this size, the place that never in Arthur's 15 years at Remington Hall had been without at least 4 people working before 7 in the morning, was abandoned. He stood in the middle of it. He looked at the cold hearth. He looked at the untouched pots hanging from their hooks. He looked at the scrubbed wooden table where every morning, without fail, Mrs. Hargrove, the cook, had begun her preparations before the sun was properly up. Mrs. Hargrove. His voice came out differently than he intended. Smaller. No answer. Arthur walked through the entire ground floor of Remington Hall in a silence so complete he could hear his own breathing. The butler's pantry empty. The laundry empty. The steward's office empty. The scullery, the still room, the servants' hall. All of them empty. All of them bearing the signs of work, simply stopped work, set aside mid-task, and not returned to. He found a single teacup on the servants' hall table, half full of cold tea. Someone had left in a hurry. He found a list of household tasks in Mrs. Hadley's handwriting on the housekeeper's board, chores assigned but unstarted. He found the stable. Empty. The horses were still there, restless in their stalls, unfed and uneasy. But every groom, every stable hand gone. Arthur Remington stood in the center of his empty stable, surrounded by the sounds of horses that needed tending, in a house that needed running, on an estate that would not wait for him to understand what had happened, and for the first time in 15 years, he was completely alone. He spent the first hour convinced there was an explanation. A funeral, perhaps. Some local event he had forgotten. An emergency of some kind that had drawn the staff away temporarily. He went back inside and searched for a note, a message, any communication that would account for the absence of every single member of his household. He found nothing. He spent the second hour in the drawing room, standing at the window, watching the drive that led to the estate gates, waiting for the carriages that would bring his people back. Watching the empty road with an expression that shifted by slow degrees from irritation to confusion to something he would not have been able to name if pressed. The road remained empty. By the third hour, Arthur Remington was in the estate office, pulling open drawers and cabinets, looking for the household ledgers, looking, if he was honest with himself, for any document that would tell him how his own house worked. He found the ledgers. He opened the most recent one. He stared at it for a long time. The numbers were meticulous. Every column precisely filled. Every entry cross-referenced. Every expenditure justified, and every income accounted for, with a thoroughness that Arthur, who had always considered himself a capable man of business, could not immediately follow. Because the handwriting was not his steward's. It was Anne's. He turned to the previous ledger. Same handwriting. The one before that. And the one before that. He pulled open a different drawer and found correspondence letters to suppliers, to neighboring estate managers, to the families of workers on the property. All in Anne's hand, all bearing a date range that stretched back years. He found a separate folder of what appeared to be personal letters, and he opened the first one. It was from Mrs. Hadley. My lady, I write to inform you that young Thomas in the stables has taken ill again, and his mother cannot manage on her wages alone. I know you have already been generous beyond what is required, but I wondered if the household fund might extend. Arthur stopped reading. He set the letter down. He sat very still. Household fund. He had never heard of a household fund. It was not in any ledger he had reviewed, or had he reviewed any. When had he last sat in this office and gone through the accounts himself? He tried to remember and found with a jolt of something unpleasant that he could not. He picked up another letter. Dear Mrs. Remington, I am writing on behalf of the Fordham family to express our deepest gratitude for your intervention in the matter of the harvest shortfall. Your arrangement with the Ashwick estate has preserved 3 families from genuine hardship this winter. We are in your debt. He set that one down too. He sat in the silence of the estate office. The same silence that had been pressing against the walls of Remington Hall since the previous morning, and he looked at the evidence spread across the desk in front of him. and Arthur Remington, for the first time, began to understand the shape of what he had done. Thomas Bennet arrived in the early afternoon. Howe was the eldest son of the Remington estate's longtime solicitor and had managed the legal affairs of the property for the past 3 years. He was a quiet man, methodical, not given to unnecessary speech. Arthur had always found him somewhat bland. That afternoon, Arthur found himself grateful for his discretion. "I need you to explain something to me." Arthur didn't offer a greeting. He pulled out the ledger and spread it open on the desk between them. "This." Thomas looked at the ledger. Then he looked at Arthur. "That's Lady Remington's household record. I can see whose handwriting it is." Arthur kept his voice even. "What I want to know is what it represents, the full scope of it. I need you to sit down and tell me everything." Thomas sat. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, but considering how to begin. "My lord," Thomas said at last, "how much of the estate management do you wish me to cover?" "All of it." Another pause. "That will take some time." "I have nothing but time at present." Arthur gestured at the empty room around him. "As you may have noticed." Thomas nodded. He folded his hands on the desk. And then he began to talk. He talked for 2 hours. He talked about the winter of 1815, when the harvest had come in 20% below what was needed to carry the estate and the tenant families through to spring. He explained how Anne had quietly liquidated a portion of her personal inheritance money that had come to her from her own family. Money that was legally hers to do with as she chose, and used it to cover the shortfall without drawing from the estate accounts or alerting any creditor to the difficulty. He talked about the arrangements Anne had made with the Ashwick estate and 2 others to the north, trading labor and resources during the seasons when Remington needed support and providing the same in return. A system that had kept the farms viable through 3 consecutive difficult years without a single formal loan. He talked about the household fund, a private account Anne had established and maintained from her own allowance, which had paid for a doctor when the Fording family's youngest child developed lung fever, which had covered the cost of a proper burial for one of the older grooms, whose family had nothing, which had kept Mrs. Hadley's aging mother in a decent situation when the woman could no longer work. "None of this came from the estate accounts?" Arthur asked. "None of it. It came from her personal funds." "From what she could manage, yes." Arthur was quiet. "The servants," he said after a moment. "The ones who are absent today. Was their departure?" "I received 7 letters this morning." Thomas reached into his coat and produced a small stack of folded papers. He set them on the desk between them. "From various members of your household staff. All written last night and delivered before dawn." Arthur did not touch the letters. "What do they say?" Thomas looked at him steadily. "They say that their employment at Remington Hall was contingent on serving a household that Lady Remington managed. They say that without her direction, they do not believe the household can be maintained in a manner consistent with what they had committed to. And they say—" A pause. "They say that they had a loyalty to her that they had never been asked to have, and that they chose to follow it." The room was quiet. "They left," Arthur said, "because she left." "They left," Thomas confirmed, "because you sent her away." It was gently said. Thomas Bennet was not a man who raised his voice or sharpened his words unnecessarily. But the distinction he had just drawn, "you sent her away," landed in the space between them with a weight that Arthur felt in his chest. He said nothing for a moment. "The reputation of the estate," he said finally. "The standing we have with the county families, with the merchants, with the Harwick Association." Thomas nodded slowly. "Lady Remington has attended every charity assembly for the past 11 years. She has corresponded personally with the wives of the county's leading families. She has maintained those relationships with considerable—" He paused, searching for the precise word. "Care. Personal care. The kind that cannot be replaced by a formal note or a substitute hostess. And without her, you would be starting those relationships from the beginning. And some of them, I suspect, you would not be able to start at all." Arthur stood. He walked to the window. He looked out at the empty drive, the well-kept grounds well-kept because Anne had supervised the groundskeeping staff, the same way she supervised everything else with the kind of quiet authority that made people want to do their best work. Why didn't she tell me? The question came out before he'd decided to ask it. Thomas was quiet for a beat longer than usual. "My lord, with respect, she did." Arthur turned from the window. "She wrote to you in the spring of 1814 about the harvest projections." Thomas's voice was careful and steady. "She wrote to you in the autumn of that year about the household fund she had established. She discussed with you directly on at least 3 occasions that I am personally aware of the arrangements she had made with the neighboring estates. She asked more than once to be included in the formal estate planning meetings, rather than managing the household concerns separately. I remember those conversations." "Do you remember your responses?" Arthur said nothing. Thomas gave him a moment. "Then, you told her the estate management was not a matter for the household. You told her that her arrangements were well-intentioned but unnecessary. You told her—" He paused. "You told her you had the matter in hand." The words settled into the silence of the room. Arthur had the matter in hand. He had said that. He could hear his own voice saying it, the easy, dismissive confidence of a man who had never once asked himself whether his confidence was earned. "Leave me." His voice was rough. Thomas stood immediately. He gathered his papers. At the door he stopped. "My lord." He did not turn around. "The letters from the staff, I would read them when you're ready. They say some things that I think you'll want to know." Then he was gone, and Arthur was alone again with the ledgers and the letters and the silence of a house that had forgotten how to breathe. He read the letters that evening, all 7 of them. Mrs. Hadley's was the longest. The housekeeper had been at Remington Hall for 23 years longer than Anne had been there, longer than Arthur himself had been its master in his own right. She wrote in a plain, direct hand without ornamentation, "My lord, I write not out of disrespect, but out of honesty, which I believe you deserve, even if it is uncomfortable. I have served this household since before you were married. I have watched Lady Remington manage it with greater skill, greater care, and greater wisdom than any mistress I have known in 40 years of service. She never asked for recognition. She never demanded credit. She simply did what needed doing day after day, year after year, while the household ran so smoothly that you never had cause to notice it was being run at all. I do not hold you in contempt, my lord. I hold you to account. There is a difference. Lady Remington was not a convenience. She was the foundation of this house. I pray you discover that before it is too late to repair what you have done." Arthur read that letter 3 times. The one from Roberts, the senior footman, was shorter, but no less precise. Roberts described in plain terms the afternoon 2 winters past, when a fire had broken out in the East Wing laundry. Anne had organized the bucket line herself directed the evacuation of the eastern servants' rooms, and prevented the fire from spreading to the main house, all before Arthur had been located to be informed. The damage had been repaired within the week. Arthur had been told it was a minor incident. He had never known that his wife had stood in the snow in her evening dress and directed the containment of a fire that could have destroyed the east wing of his ancestral home. He had never known because she had not told him, not because she was hiding it, but because by the time he was found, it was already handled, and Anne did not see the point in creating alarm after the danger had passed. He had never known because he had never asked. The letter from young James, the junior stable hand, was barely a paragraph apologetic, almost embarrassed in its brevity. But it contained one line that Arthur could not get past. She used to come to the stables on cold mornings to check that we had enough coal, my lord. Reckoned it weren't right that the horses stayed warm and the men didn't. She never said it was her doing, just made sure it was done. Arthur set the letters down. He looked around the empty room. I thought about all the mornings he had ridden out on a horse that had been properly fed and groomed and tended by men who were themselves properly cared for, and he had not once stopped to wonder why. He had simply assumed that things worked. He had assumed that things worked because they were his, because his name was on the deed, because he was Arthur Remington of Remington Hall. He had never once stopped to ask who made it work. Eleanor Whitmore came to call the following afternoon. She arrived in a well-appointed carriage dressed in the careful elegance she always wore. The kind of elegance that was meant to be noticed, that announced itself with every detail. She was a handsome woman, Eleanor. Persuasive in the particular way of people who had learned to make their ambitions sound like concern for others. She had been coming to Remington Hall for the better part of 18 months, offering advice, offering perspective, offering. Arthur now understood with a cold clarity he had not possessed 48 hours ago. Her interpretation of everything Anne did filtered through Eleanor's own particular understanding of what she wanted the outcome to be. She came into the morning room and looked around at the unmade table, the undressed windows, the general disarray of a house, suddenly without anyone to run it. Her expression moved through surprise to something that might have been satisfaction before she schooled it back into concern. "My lord," she said, "I heard about the staff. It's quite shocking. The disloyalty." "Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore." Something in his voice stopped her. She sat. Arthur stood by the window. He did not turn to look at her immediately. "I've been going through the estate records," he said. "Oh." Her voice was careful. "The household ledgers, the correspondence, the arrangement with the Ashwick estate, the harvest management from 1815. A pause. "The household fund." He heard her shift slightly in her chair. "I had a conversation with Thomas Bennet yesterday that I should have had 3 years ago." Now he turned. "He told me a great many things I did not know about my own estate, about how it runs, about who runs it." Eleanor's expression was composed. It was always composed. That was part of what had made her so convincing, that composure that looked like certainty. "My lord, if you're suggesting that Lady Remington's—" "I'm not suggesting anything." He crossed the room until he stood in front of her. Not threatening, simply close enough that the distance between them could not soften what he said. "I'm telling you what I know. You spent 18 months in this house telling me that my wife was overstepping, that she was making herself too important, that a woman of her position had no business involving herself in estate management and tenant affairs and financial arrangements." He let the silence hold for a moment. "You were very persuasive. I was only trying to—" "I know what you were trying to do." His voice was quiet. Quieter than she expected, he could tell, because the composure slipped slightly. "You were trying to move into the space that Anne had created. You saw a household that ran beautifully, and you understood better than I did. I'll give you that it ran because of her. And you understood that if she was gone, there would be a vacancy, and you intended to fill it." The room was very still. I'm not finished." He stepped back, put distance between them. He did not want to be close to Eleanor Whitmore right now. He didn't want her face in his line of vision when he said the rest of it. "You did not destroy my household. I want to be clear about that. You offered me a direction, and I chose to walk in it. I signed that paper. I handed it to her. I stood there while she read it and walked away from me." He stopped, looked at the floor, looked up again. "Every mistake that has been made in this house in the past 48 hours belongs to me, not to you. I don't give you that much credit." Eleanor Whitmore stood. Her composure was firmly back in place, but something behind her eyes had gone wary. "If you're asking me to leave, I'm asking you to leave," he said simply, "and I'm asking you not to come back." She left. She left without a scene, because Eleanor Whitmore was too skilled for scenes. She simply walked to the door, collected her things from the entrance hall, and departed in her well-appointed carriage with her chin at its usual angle. Arthur watched the carriage move down the drive until it disappeared through the gates. Then he turned back to the empty house, and he went to find Thomas Bennet. "I need to find her," he said. Thomas did not ask who. She went to Linfield. Linfield was the Montgomery family's smaller estate, 30 miles northeast. Anne's younger sister lived there with her husband. It was where Anne had been born, where she had grown up before she married into the Remington name. How long has she been there? Since Friday morning. 2 days. She had been gone 2 days, and in those 2 days, Arthur Remington had lived inside the wreckage of everything she had quietly maintained, and he had finally understood what he was looking at. "Is she—" He stopped, started again. "Is she well?" Thomas looked at him for a moment with the careful expression of a man choosing his words. "From what I understand, my lord, she is managing." "Managing. Not fine, not well. Managing." Arthur nodded. "I need to prepare to travel tomorrow." He looked around the empty house. "I don't suppose you know how to make coffee." For the first time in the conversation, Thomas Bennett's expression cracked just slightly into something that might, under different circumstances, have been a smile. "I know enough to get by, my lord." "Then get by." Arthur straightened. "Because I have a great deal to think through tonight, and I am going to need something hot to do it with." He walked away from Thomas and back toward the estate office, back toward the ledgers and the letters and the evidence of 15 years he had failed to properly see. Tomorrow, he would go to Linfield. Tonight, he would sit with the truth of what he had done. He owed himself that much. He owed her that much more. The fire in the estate office had not been laid. Arthur Remington laded himself badly, imperfectly, with more smoke than flame at first, and when it finally caught, he sat down in front of it with Anne's ledgers open across his knees and began to read. He read until the fire burned low. He did not stop to light another. He just kept reading, because the handwriting on every page was hers, and the care in every number was hers, and the world she had quietly built and maintained for 15 years was laid out in those columns, with all the detail and devotion of a woman who had loved something enough to give it everything she had. A woman he had handed separation papers to on a Thursday afternoon. A woman who had said, "Very well, my lord," and walked away without a single word of the argument she had every right to make. He closed the last ledger as the fire went to coals. The house was very quiet around him. I was beginning to understand that the silence was not empty. It was the shape of everything she had been. The road to Linfield was 30 miles of hard thinking. Arthur had not slept well. He had dozed in the estate office chair sometime past midnight, the ledgers still open across his knees, and woken before dawn with a stiff neck and the particular hollowness of a man who has spent the dark hours facing things he cannot unface. He had washed, dressed himself again, still badly, still without help, eaten a piece of bread he found in the kitchen larder, and told Thomas Bennett he would be traveling that morning. Thomas had simply nodded and arranged for the carriage. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of English autumn morning that presses down on everything with equal indifference. Arthur sat inside the carriage and did not look out the window. There was nothing out there he needed to see. What he needed to see was already in front of him, the map of his own blindness, which had been growing more detailed with every hour since Thursday. He had been married to Anne for 15 years. 15 years. In that time, he had learned the names of every horse in his stable, the vintage year of every significant bottle in his wine cellar, the terms of every formal business arrangement connected to the Remington name. He knew the acreage of his estate to the decimal point. He knew the provisions of his father's will by memory. He did not know that his wife had used her personal inheritance to save his tenants in 1815. He did not know that she had stood in the snow in her evening dress to contain a fire that could have taken the East Wing. He did not know that she had built and maintained a private fund that had kept at least a dozen families afloat in their hardest seasons. He had not known any of it. The question that rode with him all 30 miles, the one he could not silence, was not "How did she hide it from me?" It was, "Why didn't I notice her?" Linfield was smaller than Remington Hall, warmer in character, the kind of house that felt lived in rather than maintained. Arthur had visited perhaps 4 times in 15 years of marriage. He had never found a reason to come more often. Anne's sister Margaret and her husband Charles Fairfield were pleasant enough company, but the Fairfields were not a family of significant standing, and Arthur had other demands on his time. He thought about that as the carriage turned through the Linfield gates. He thought about all the times Anne had asked him to accompany her here and the various reasons he had given for declining. I thought about the letters she had written to Margaret, that he had never asked about the conversations she had had with her sister during the visits she made alone. The private life she had maintained between Remington Hall and this smaller, warmer house, a life he had never shown the slightest interest in understanding. The carriage stopped. Arthur stepped down before the footman could assist him. Margaret Fairfield was standing in the open doorway. She was 2 years younger than Anne, with the same dark eyes and the same quality of stillness. But where Anne's stillness was composed, Margaret's was currently something quite different. She looked at Arthur Remington the way a woman looks at a man she has long had opinions about and has just been given permission to express them. She did not come down the steps to meet him. "Mr. Remington?" "Not, my lord." The omission was deliberate, and they both knew it. "Mrs. Fairfield." He stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at her. "I've come to speak with Anne." "I know why you've come." "Then perhaps you'd allow me inside." Margaret's chin lifted slightly. The resemblance to Anne in that moment was so precise, it hit him somewhere unexpected. "She doesn't know you're coming." "No." "She doesn't expect you." "I expect she doesn't." A pause. Margaret looked at him with those steady dark eyes, measuring, calculating, arriving at a decision. "She's in the garden." She stepped aside. "I'll ask you not to upset her. She has had quite enough of that already." The word already carried 15 years of things Margaret Fairfield had never said to his face. Arthur walked past her into the house. The Linfield garden was not large. It was the kind of private space that belonged to a woman who planted things and watched them grow without needing anyone to admire them alongside her. Anne was at the far end of it near a low stone wall with her back to the house. She was not doing anything in particular. Standing. Thinking. The kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from a woman who has been very busy processing something enormous and has temporarily run out of words for it. She heard him before he reached her. He was not quiet on the gravel path, and he was not trying to be. She turned. Her face moved through recognition, and then through something more complicated. Something that was not quite surprise, not quite resignation, but some careful mixture of both. She did not speak first. She waited. "I should have come yesterday," Arthur said. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to give her room. "I would have come yesterday, except I spent most of it in the estate office, reading things I should have read years ago." Anne looked at him steadily. "The ledgers." "The ledgers, the correspondence, the letters from the staff." He paused. "7 of them in case you weren't certain of the count." Something moved behind her eyes. Not satisfaction, it was too tired for satisfaction. "I didn't ask them to." "I know you didn't." He said it quickly because he needed her to know he understood that. "Thomas told me. They made that decision for themselves. Mrs. Hadley made it for herself. James the stable hand made it for himself." He let that settle. "That's what happens apparently when you spend 15 years treating people with the kind of decency that makes them want to follow you anywhere." Anne looked away from him. Out over the garden wall. Her profile was as composed as it had always been, but he could see the effort in it now, in a way he never had before, the particular tension of a woman holding herself very carefully together. "Why are you here, Arthur?" The question was direct, simple. And it was the right question because there were several possible answers, several versions of himself that could have made this journey, and she deserved to know which one had arrived at her door. "Because I owe you an accounting," he said. "Not an apology yet. I'm not certain I've earned the right to ask you to receive one. But an accounting, yes. That I owe you, regardless of what you decide to do with it." She turned back to look at him. "All right." Her voice was measured, careful. "Then account." He talked for a long time. He told her what he had found in the ledgers. He told her what Thomas had explained the winter of 1815, the harvest arrangements, the household fund. He told her about reading Mrs. Hadley's letter 3 times. He told her about James's paragraph and the coal in the stables, and standing in his own kitchen, looking at a cold hearth, and understanding for the first time that cold hearths were not the default state of the world, that someone had always made sure the fire was laid. He told her about Eleanor. He told her about the confrontation in the morning room, and what he had said, and what Eleanor had not said in return. He told her that Eleanor was gone, and would not be returning, not because he wanted credit for that decision, but because he thought she deserved to know it. He told her about the night in the estate office, the ledgers on his knees, the fire he had laid badly, the pages he had read until the coals went gray. When he stopped talking, Anne was quiet for a moment. The garden around them held its stillness. "You read all of it," she said finally. "Everything I could find. The letters, too, from the tenants. Every one." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was something raw in her expression that she did not try to cover. "I kept those letters because—" She stopped, started again. "Because there were days when I needed to know that what I was doing mattered. When it was very difficult to believe that." A pause. "I didn't keep them to prove something to you. You understand that." "I understand that. I wasn't building a case against you." "I know. I was just—" The composure shifted. Not broke. Anne's composure did not break easily, but shifted in the way of a woman who is very tired of holding a particular weight and has decided just for a moment to set it down. "I was trying to keep something alive. The house. The people in it. The idea that Remington Hall was more than a name on a deed. That it was a place where people were looked after." She looked at him directly. "And I kept hoping you would look up one day and see what I was doing and ask to be part of it." The words landed in the space between them with a precision that would have staggered him if he hadn't already spent 24 hours being staggered. "I didn't," he said. "No, you didn't. I told you it was handled." "You did." "When what I meant was that I didn't want to look." She was very still. "Because looking—" Arthur continued, and his voice had changed now, slower, more deliberate, the voice of a man choosing each word with care because he understands. He only gets one chance to say this right. "Would have meant admitting that I didn't understand my own house as well as my wife did. And I wasn't willing to admit that. Not to you, not to myself." He stopped. "That's not an excuse. That's an explanation. There's a difference." Anne's hands were folded in front of her. Her knuckles were white. "You told me," in the spring of 1814, "that the harvest projections concerned you. I told you it wasn't your area of concern." "Yes." "You told me about Eleanor. Twice at least that I remember now, though I didn't want to remember it before." He didn't look away from her face. "You told me you thought she was trying to position herself in this household. I told you you were imagining it." Silence. "You were not imagining it." Anne's breath came out slowly. It was the kind of breath that had been held a long time. "No," she said quietly. "I wasn't." Margaret appeared at the garden gate with a tea tray, took one look at the two of them, set the tray on the stone bench near the wall with a decisive click, and withdrew without a word. It was the most tactful thing Arthur had ever witnessed her do. Anne poured the tea. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. He was beginning to understand that steadiness, not as coldness, which was how he had always interpreted it, but as the hard-won discipline of a woman who had learned over many years that if she fell apart, everything around her would too. She handed him a cup. He took it. For a few minutes, they simply stood there in the quiet garden of Linfield, drinking tea in the chill of an October morning, like two people who had temporarily run out of the harder words. Then Anne said, "What do you want, Arthur, truly? Not what do you want from me? Not what are you asking for? Just what do you want, truly?" It was such a simple question that it should have had a simple answer. "I want to understand," he said. "I want to understand how it worked. All of it. Everything you managed. Everything you knew about that estate that I should have known and didn't." He turned the cup in his hands. "And I want to understand how I can fix what I've broken." "You can't fix all of it." "I know. Some of the trust that was damaged." She stopped. "Some things take a very long time to rebuild, if they rebuild at all." "I know that too." She looked at him with those steady dark eyes, and he held her gaze in a way he was not certain he had done in years. Not the surface look of a man confirming someone's presence, but the real looking of a man trying to understand who was standing in front of him. "The staff," she said. "They're not coming back simply because you ask." "I know. They came here because I asked them not to do anything rash. They're in the village 2 miles from Linfield. I've been making sure they're all right." She said it almost defensively, as if expecting him to object. "Old habit." "Of course you have." He said it without irony, without anything but the plain recognition it deserved. She blinked. It was the smallest thing. A single, almost imperceptible blink. But he saw it, and he understood what it meant, that she had expected a different response, had been braced for a different response, had spent 15 years being braced for responses that dismissed what she did as unnecessary or overreaching. He had been that predictable for 15 years. The understanding of it sat in his chest like a stone. He stayed at Linfield for the afternoon. Margaret was not warm to him, but she was civil, the tight, controlled civility of a woman extending courtesy for her sister's sake, and not for his. She served a midday meal and did not attempt conversation beyond what was required. Her husband Charles was away on business, and therefore spared everyone the additional awkwardness of his presence. After the meal, Anne walked with Arthur through the Linfield grounds. Not the garden, the wider grounds, the farm fields, and the wood at the property's edge. She walked the way she always walked, straight-backed, purposeful, as if she always knew exactly where she was going, even when she was simply walking. She talked, and Arthur listened. She talked about the Fordham family, first the Tennant family, whose youngest child had developed lung fever in the winter of 1816. She explained how she had found out through Mrs. Hadley, who had heard from the village doctor, who had mentioned it in passing, without any expectation that the information would go further. She explained the decision she had made that afternoon alone in the East study to use the household fund to cover the doctor's extended visits and the medicine required. Thomas knew about it, she said. I asked him not to include it in any formal report. Because you thought I would object. A pause that was its own answer. Yes, she said. Because I thought you would object. Would I have? She glanced at him sideways. In 1816, almost certainly. You would have said it wasn't the estate's responsibility. You would have said there were proper channels for charitable assistance, and this wasn't how they worked. She looked forward again. You wouldn't have been angry exactly. You would have been measured, precise. You would have explained why it wasn't appropriate and asked me not to do it again. And you would have done it again anyway. Her mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. The child needed a doctor, she said. It was such a simple statement. Such a completely obvious and simple statement. The kind that made the 15 years of careful workaround she had navigated feel in retrospect like an enormous weight she had been carrying in complete silence. I want to tell you something, Arthur said. And I need you to hear it, not as an attempt to recover my position with you, because I don't think I've earned that today. I just need you to hear it. She stopped walking. She turned to face him. The reputation of Remington Hall, he said, is entirely yours, not mine. I know that now. The standing we have with the county families, with the merchants, with everyone who has ever trusted the name, that trust was built by you. It was built by 15 years of letters you wrote, and visits you made, and people you looked after, and problems you solved, without ever once asking to have your name attached to the solution. He paused. I put my name on that estate. You built what the name stood for. The wind moved across the open field between them and the wood. Anne looked at him for a long moment. That is the most honest thing you've said to me in a very long time, she said at last. He had no response to that. There wasn't one. She was right. They turned back toward the house, and it was then on the return walk, with Linfield's chimneys visible ahead, and the light starting to thin toward late afternoon, that she told him about Eleanor. Not what Eleanor had done. Arthur knew most of that already. What Anne told him was what it had been like to watch it happen. She was very good, Anne said. I want you to understand that. She was very skilled at what she did. She never said anything directly against me, nothing you could have pointed to and called unfair. It was always a suggestion, a gentle question. Does Lady Remington manage the tenant correspondence herself? How unusual. Most estates of this standing use the steward for that. Or I notice the household accounts have been handled somewhat unconventionally. I'm sure it works perfectly well, but Lord Remington might prefer a more traditional arrangement. Anne's voice was perfectly even. She planted the idea that everything I did was unconventional, that unconventional meant wrong, And then she waited for you to agree, and I agreed. He didn't make it a question. Over time, not immediately. It took her the better part of a year. Anne was quiet for a moment. I tried to tell you. I know you know that now, and I know it's too late for this particular telling, but I want you to know that I tried. Because for a long time I thought perhaps I hadn't been clear enough. Perhaps I had approached it wrong. Perhaps if I had said it differently, you would have heard me. You said it clearly. His voice was rough. I chose not to hear it. She nodded. Once. A small, precise acknowledgement that required no additional words. She wanted the position, Anne said. The position I had. Not the work. She wouldn't have wanted the work. She wanted the standing. The title of the woman whose opinion shaped Remington Hall. The invitations. The social authority. A pause. She understood that I was the thing standing between her and what she wanted. So she made herself very useful to you and very quietly inconvenient to me. I should have seen it. Yes. No softening. No, don't be too hard on yourself. Just yes. He respected her for that. They reached the house. Margaret was visible through the drawing-room window, pointedly occupied with needlework. The light was failing. Arthur's carriage had been waiting for 2 hours. He stopped at the foot of the entry steps. I'm not going to ask you to come home today, he said. That's not why I came. I came to tell you what I found and to tell you what I understand now that I didn't understand before. He looked at her squarely. But I want you to know that Remington Hall is your house. It has always been your house in every way that matters. Your name belongs on those estate documents, not hidden in the ledgers. Your decisions belong in the formal record, not managed quietly through back channels, because I was too proud to share the responsibility. He stopped. That's what I want to change. Not to bring you back to the same arrangement. To build a different one. Anne stood on the second step, which put her at almost exactly his eye level. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, but it wasn't cold. Whatever it wasn't cold. You burned the fire down in the estate office last night, she said. He blinked. Thomas told you. Thomas tells me a great many things. The ghost of that almost smile again. He's been doing it for 3 years. I suspected as much. He said you laid it yourself. Badly. He said that too. The almost smile held for a moment longer. Then it faded, and what replaced it was something more serious, the expression of a woman who is making a very careful calculation. I'm not coming back to Remington Hall tomorrow, Arthur. You understand that? Yes. I need time to think, and you need time to do more than think. You need time to demonstrate that what you're saying today isn't simply the response of a man who discovered his household doesn't function without his wife. That landed hard, because it was precisely the fear he'd been carrying since the carriage ride. The fear that what he was feeling was not genuine, changed understanding, but simple selfish panic at the collapse of his comfort. How do I prove the difference? He asked. She looked at him for a long moment. Start with the staff, she said. They're at the Linfield Village Inn, all of them. They've been there since Friday, and they deserve to know what's happening. She paused. Go to them before you go home. Not to bring them back, just to speak to them directly. To apologize for putting them in the position of having to choose. To acknowledge what they lost when they chose. She held his gaze. Then go home and write to Thomas about the estate documents, formally, in writing. Put on record what you told me today about whose work built Remington Hall's standing. He nodded. And then, she said, come back next week, and the week after, and we'll see. She went inside. The door closed behind her with the same quiet precision as it had on Thursday, the same deliberate, unhurried click. But this time, something in it was different. This time, it was not the sound of a door closing on him. This time, it sounded just barely like a door that had been left unlocked. The Linfield Village Inn was a low, warm building that smelled of wood smoke and something baking. Arthur walked in without ceremony. They were all there. Mrs. Hadley at a table near the fire with a cup of tea. 4 of the housemaids clustered at the far end of the room. Roberts and 2 of the footmen at the bar. James, the stable hand, sitting by himself near the window, with the particular self-consciousness of someone who is 20 years old and has done something significant and is still deciding whether he was right to do it. The room went very quiet when Arthur Remington walked through the door. He stood in the middle of it and let them look at him. He did not straighten his coat or lift his chin or do any of the things a man of his position might do to reassert the distance between himself and the people who worked for him. He just stood there in the warm, low light of the inn and let them see that he had come without armor. "I read your letters," he said. Not loudly. The room was quiet enough that he didn't need volume. All of them, more than once. He looked at Mrs. Hadley first because her letter had hit the hardest and she deserved to know he was talking to her when he talked to her. "You were honest with me. All of you were honest with me in a way I hadn't given you any reason to be, and I want you to know that it mattered." Mrs. Hadley set her cup down. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has made her peace with speaking her mind and is prepared to do it again if required. "My lord." Her voice was steady. "Have you gone to see her?" "I've just come from Linfield, and nothing is decided. But I went. I listened. I told her the truth." He looked around the room at all of them. The faces of the people who had spent years in Anne's household, who had followed her without being asked, who had left without being told. "I'm not here to ask you to come back today. I'm here because she told me to come to you first, and because she was right that it mattered, and because I owe you an apology that has nothing to do with whether you ever return to Remington Hall." The room was very still. James from his seat by the window said, "Is she all right, my lord, Lady Remington?" It was the question of someone who had simply needed an answer to the most important thing, regardless of rank or propriety. He asked it the way the young ask things directly, without the layered caution of adults who have learned to protect themselves. Arthur looked at him. "She's managing," he said. And then, because the boy deserved better than the careful answer, "She's stronger than I gave her credit for being, which is the most honest thing I can tell you." James nodded. Something in his young face settled. Mrs. Hadley picked her tea back up. "We'll be staying at the inn a few more days, my lord," she said. Calm, even. Not quite forgiving, not yet, but something softer than the letter she had written at midnight. "Stay as long as you need." He looked at her directly. "The room and board is on the Remington account. It has been since you arrived, though I understand if you weren't informed." He turned toward the door, stopped, turned back. "I want you to know that whatever you decide, whether you come back or whether you don't, the choice is yours. I am done being the man in that house who makes choices on behalf of people without asking what they want." He left. The night air outside the inn was cold and sharp. Arthur stood in it for a moment, breathing. He got back in the carriage. 30 miles home. 30 miles to sit with the fact that he had spent the whole of this day doing things he should have done 15 years ago, and that the doing of them now, however necessary, however genuine, did not undo a single day of what had come before. That was the weight. Not the empty house, not the cold hearths, not the silent corridors. The weight was knowing that Anne had been there every day for 15 years, and he had never once made her feel that he truly saw her. He had a great deal of work ahead of him, and for the first time in his life, he understood that the work was not about Remington Hall. It was about becoming a man worthy of the woman who had held it together. He wasn't there yet, but the door at Linfield had been left unlocked, and that was enough to keep going. The formal letter to Thomas Bennet took Arthur 3 attempts to write. The first version was too legal, too careful, the language of a man protecting himself rather than making a genuine record. He read it back and heard in it all the habits of a lifetime. The instinct to frame every statement in a way that preserved his authority while appearing to share it. He threw it in the fire. The second version overcorrected. It read like a confession of incompetence, the kind of document that would undermine every practical arrangement the estate required. Thomas was a solicitor. He needed facts, not a man flagellating himself across official correspondence. Arthur threw that one in the fire too. The third version took an hour to write, and was half the length of the other 2. It stated in plain language that Lady Anne Montgomery Remington had managed the household accounts and tenant relations of Remington Hall for the entirety of their marriage. that these contributions had been material, substantial, and essential to the estate's continued standing and financial stability. That going forward her name was to appear on all relevant household documents. That her decisions regarding tenant welfare, household management, and estate correspondence were to be formally recognized as decisions, not suggestions, not informal arrangements, not well-intentioned interventions, but decisions carrying the same weight as any made by the lord of the estate. He signed it. He had Thomas countersign it the following morning. He did not feel like a man who had done something generous. He felt like a man who had finally told the truth on paper after 15 years of letting the lie stand by omission. That was a different thing entirely. The week that followed was the longest of Arthur Remington's adult life. Remington Hall, without a full household staff, was not impossible to function within, but it was deeply uncomfortable in a way that went beyond cold hearths and unmade beds. It was the discomfort of a man living inside the evidence of his own miscalculation. Every empty room was a reminder. Every meal he had to arrange for himself badly, without the instincts of someone who had ever needed to arrange such things, was another page in the accounting he was running against himself. Thomas found him a temporary cook, a woman from the village who came in the mornings and left by mid-afternoon. She was competent and entirely uninterested in Arthur's opinions about anything. She made adequate food, kept the kitchen from disaster, and communicated almost exclusively through a series of expressive silences that Arthur found after some days oddly clarifying. He went back to Linfield on Wednesday. Anne received him in the drawing room this time. Not the garden, the drawing room, with Margaret pointedly present for the first quarter hour before finding somewhere else to be. Anne had tea prepared. She sat across from him in the manner of a woman who is not unwelcoming, but who has decided not to make things easy simply for the sake of ease. He told her about the letter to Thomas. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to tell me about it," she said finally. "You could have simply done it. I wanted you to know it was done." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you've spent 15 years doing things without telling me. I thought it was time to try the opposite approach." Something shifted in her expression. It wasn't a smile, it was smaller than that, more interior. The kind of response a person has when they've heard something that lands in a place they weren't expecting. "Thomas wrote to me," she said. "I thought he might. He said," she paused, gathered something. "He said the letter was the most straightforward document he'd received from you in 10 years of professional correspondence." Arthur said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's a damning thing to hear." "Yes." She picked up her teacup. "It is." They stayed for 2 hours. They talked, genuinely talked, the kind of conversation that requires both people to stay present and uncomfortable and honest, rather than retreating into the easier scripts of 15 years. Anne told him things she had never said directly. He asked questions he had never thought to ask. The conversation was not easy. It was not warm, not in the way that warmth comes easily. But it was real, and by the time Arthur stood to leave, something in the room felt different than when he had arrived. At the door, Anne said, "Come back on Saturday." He came back on Saturday. He came back the following Tuesday as well, because Margaret had mentioned in the deliberate, slightly too casual way of a woman passing information she once acted upon that Anne had been receiving some unwelcome correspondence. Arthur had not pressed for details that Tuesday. He had filed the information and let it sit, aware that pushing would be exactly the wrong thing to do. Anne was not a woman who appreciated being managed on her own behalf. She had spent 15 years watching that happen and had ended up with separation papers for her trouble. But by Thursday of the second week, he could not let it sit any longer. He found out through Thomas. Of course he found out through Thomas. Thomas arrived at Remington Hall on Thursday morning with the expression of a man carrying news he has been weighing for several days and has finally decided must be delivered in person. "The Harwick letters," Thomas said once they were seated in the estate office. He placed a slim folder on the desk between them. "I've been aware of them for approximately a week. Lady Remington asked me not to trouble you with the matter. I've decided that her instruction in this particular case does not override my professional judgment." Arthur opened the folder. There were 4 letters, All written on Harwick Association stationery, the formal letterhead of the county's oldest and most influential charitable organization, the body through which half the significant social transactions of the county's leading families were conducted. Anne had been the Remington Hall representative to the Harwick Association for 11 years. She had served as its secretary for the last 4. The letters were from Sir Edmund Harwick himself. Arthur read the first one. The language was formal, careful, layered in the particular way of men who understand that what they mean and what they write must maintain a safe distance from each other. But the meaning stripped of its politeness was this, given the changed circumstances at Remington Hall, the separation, the disruption to the household. The association felt it prudent to review Lady Remington's position as secretary. Her continued representation of the estate in the current situation created a certain ambiguity that the association could not simply overlook. Arthur read the second letter. This one was less careful. It suggested that Eleanor Whitmore, who was of course already known to many association members through her various philanthropic contributions, had expressed a willingness to take on the secretarial responsibilities during this transitional period. The third letter referenced a formal vote scheduled for the following Monday. The fourth, Arthur's hand tightened on the paper. The fourth was a private note. Not from Sir Edmund. From Lady Cecily Harwick, his wife, who had been Anne's closest ally in the association for years. My dear Anne, I write not in my official capacity, but as your friend. I do not know what has happened at Remington Hall, and I will not press you for details you have not offered. But I must tell you that Eleanor Whitmore has been exceedingly busy on your behalf, or rather in your absence. She has spoken to Edmund 3 times this week. She has made several visits to association members that I know of, and likely several I do not. I do not know what she has told them. I do know that whatever it is working. I urge you to respond to Edmund's letter before Monday. Whatever your situation, your record of service to this association speaks for itself. Do not let her rewrite it. Arthur set the letters down. He looked at Thomas. She's been dealing with this alone, Arthur said. His voice was very quiet. While I've been making weekly visits and writing formal letters to you, and telling myself I'm changing. Thomas held his gaze without flinching. Yes, my lord. And she told you not to tell me. She said it was her matter to handle. Of course she did. He pushed back from the desk. Stood. The familiar cold of the estate office, which he had been living in for 2 weeks now, in various states of late-night reckoning, pressed around him. Because she has spent 15 years handling her own matters and mine and the estate's without asking for assistance. Because every time she asked, I told her it wasn't necessary. Thomas said nothing. He didn't need to. What time does the first coach leave for Linfield? 8 o'clock if you take the Ashwick Road. But my lord. A pause. I would suggest reading the last letter in the folder first. Arthur looked at the folder. He had not noticed a 5th document. He lifted it out. It was not a letter. It was a handwritten list. 4 pages dense with names, dates, and brief notations. Arthur recognized it. It was in Anne's handwriting, the same precise hand he had spent 2 weeks learning to recognize in ledgers and correspondence files. He started reading. The list was a record of every significant action Anne had taken on behalf of the Harwick Association in 11 years. Not a summary, a record. Names of families assisted. Amounts arranged. Problems mediated. Events organized and executed. Alliances built between feuding county families that had ultimately benefited the association's work. Correspondence initiated, maintained, and successfully concluded. 11 years of work on 4 dense pages. At the bottom of the final page, in ink that looked slightly different, slightly newer. Anne had written for the record, if it is ever needed. She had compiled this list herself, quietly. In preparation for a fight she had not yet decided whether to have. Arthur folded the list carefully and placed it inside his coat. 8 o'clock, he said. Tell the driver. Anne met him at the Linfield door herself that morning, which told him she had been expecting him earlier than he arrived. Margaret was not visible. The house had a tense, held-breath quality. Thomas told you. She said it without preamble, without particular heat. the voice of a woman who had already processed the conversation she was about to have. Thomas told me. He followed her into the drawing room. She did not sit. Neither did he. You should have told me. It was my matter. It was not only your matter. The firmness in his voice surprised them both, but he did not walk it back. Eleanor Whitmore is pursuing the Harwick position because of what happened at Remington Hall. What happened at Remington Hall happened because of my decision. This is not simply your matter. It is also mine, and I am asking you to let me stand in it with you. Anne looked at him. The silence lasted long enough that he felt every second of it. You cannot go to Edmund Harwick on my behalf, she said finally. If you walk into that meeting and advocate for me, it will look exactly like what Eleanor wants it to look like, a husband managing a wife's affairs because she cannot manage them herself. I know. He reached into his coat and produced the folded list. He held it out to her. That's not what I intend to do. She looked at the paper. She recognized it immediately. He saw the recognition move across her face. Where did you? Thomas had it. You gave it to him. A pause. I gave it to him for safekeeping, in case something happened. She looked at the paper in his hand. I didn't intend for you to see it. I know. He kept his hand extended. I'm giving it back, because it belongs to you, and because you are going to walk into that Monday meeting yourself with that list, and you are going to hand it to Sir Edmund Harwick and let 11 years speak louder than anything Eleanor Whitmore has said in the last 3 weeks. Anne did not take the paper yet. And you? She asked. I will write to Sir Edmund before Monday, he said. Not advocating for you, simply stating for the formal record that Lady Remington's contributions to the Harwick Association have always had the full knowledge and support of Remington Hall. That nothing about the current circumstances of our household changes that record, and that any suggestion otherwise is inaccurate. She looked at the list in his outstretched hand. You'll let me handle the meeting. It's your meeting to handle. You won't try to, Anne. He said her name the way he had not said it in years. Not as an address, not as a way of moving a conversation forward, but as the name of a specific person he was trying very hard to see clearly. I have spent 15 years not letting you handle things. I am trying imperfectly and late to do the opposite. I am not going to get it right every time immediately. But I am asking you to tell me when I get it wrong instead of simply managing around me. Because I cannot correct what I cannot see. She took the paper from his hand. She held it for a moment. Then she said, You're going to have to learn to be corrected. I know. I am not a gentle teacher when I'm angry. I am beginning to understand that. He held her gaze. I can work with it. Something in her face that controlled carefully managed composure shifted again. Not broke, shifted, like a door opening a fraction wider than before. Sit down, Arthur, she said. We have a great deal to plan before Monday. Chag. The Monday meeting of the Harwick Association was held in the Grand Hall of Ashwick House, 8 miles from Linfield. 23 members attended. Sir Edmund presided with the mild, self-important authority of a man who has held the same position for so long, he has forgotten that positions are held rather than owned. Eleanor Whitmore was present. She arrived early. Arthur knew because Lady Cecily Harwick had written to Anne the night before with precisely that information. Eleanor sat at the far end of the long table in the green dress she wore to important occasions, and she watched the door with the patient confidence of a woman who believed the outcome had already been arranged. Anne arrived exactly on time. She walked into that room wearing her best day dress, deep blue. Simply cut, the kind of clothing that made no argument but required none. She carried her 11 years of association records in a leather folio that had belonged to her mother. She greeted Lady Cecily first warmly with the ease of genuine friendship. She greeted Sir Edmund with measured courtesy. She greeted each member of the association by name in the unhurried way of a woman who had taken the time to know them, not as faces attached to useful connections, but as people with histories and concerns and names that deserve to be remembered correctly. She did not acknowledge Eleanor. Not as a snub, not visibly, not in a way that could be labeled as rudeness. She simply did not make her way to that end of the table. She moved through the room as if that section of it did not require her particular attention, and the effect was more devastating than any direct cut could have been. Eleanor's expression did not change. She was too skilled for that. But her hands on the table in front of her were very still. When Sir Edmund opened the meeting, he addressed the question of the secretarial position with the careful formality of a man who has written himself a script and intends to follow it. Given the circumstances of recent months, he began, the association felt it appropriate to review, if I may. Anne's voice was perfectly modulated, calm, clear, utterly composed. She did not ask permission so much as create a moment in which denial would have been awkward. Sir Edmund stopped. I have prepared a document for the association's consideration. She opened the folio. A record of the secretarial work completed over the past 11 years. I thought it might be useful to the review to have a concrete account of what the position entails and what has been accomplished within it. She distributed the copies she had made, one to Sir Edmund, one to Lady Cecily, and one to each member of the table in turn. She did this herself, moving around the table with unhurried efficiency because she was the secretary and it was her job, and she was doing it rather than asking anyone else to. When she came to Eleanor's section of the table, she placed the document in front of Eleanor's neighbor without a glance at Eleanor herself. Eleanor received no copy. The absence was noticed by everyone in the room and commented upon by no one. Arthur's letter had arrived at Sir Edmund's house the previous Saturday morning. He knew this because Lady Cecily had confirmed it. It was not read aloud in the meeting. It was a private correspondence, and he had written it as such. But it had been read by Sir Edmund and by his wife, and the reading of it had done exactly what Arthur had intended, not made a case, but corrected the record. Stated plainly that whatever was happening inside Remington Hall's private circumstances, the association's assumptions about its relationship with Lady Remington were based on accurate information, and that information remained accurate. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it concluded, Anne remained as secretary of the Harwick Association. The vote was 17-4. Eleanor Whitmore did not stay for the reception that followed. She gathered her things during the final procedural business and slipped out before Sir Edmund closed the session. She did it smoothly. Eleanor always did things smoothly, but she did it, and the people who noticed it had context enough to understand what it meant. Anne stayed for the full reception. She stood with Lady Cecily near the far window and talked for nearly an hour. Genuinely talked with the warmth and easy humor of a woman who had just survived something significant and was letting herself feel the relief of it among friends. Lady Cecily, who was a woman of considerable perception herself, watched Anne with the expression of someone who has had their faith confirmed in a thing they very much wanted to believe in. On the carriage ride back to Linfield, Anne was quiet. Not the tense-held quiet of the past 3 weeks. The different quiet. The quiet of someone who has been through something and come out the other side and needs a moment to simply exist in the aftermath of it. Halfway back, she said, "The letter helped." "It was the truth," Arthur said. "That's all it was." "Edmund read it twice, Cecily told me." She paused. "He was surprised by it." "I imagine he was. I expected you to either not write at all or to write something that made the situation worse." She looked out the carriage window. "He's known you for a long time." "Apparently not as well as he thought." A beat. "Apparently not as well as I thought either." She turned from the window. She looked at him in the way she had been doing with increasing frequency over these 2 weeks directly, without the careful management she had once maintained between his reality and hers. "Eleanor will not stop," Anne said quietly. "You understand that." "I know. She has lost this particular move. She'll look for another angle." A pause. "She's patient. She's been patient for 1.5 years already." "Then we'll be more patient." He held her gaze. "Together. If you'll allow it." Anne was quiet for a moment. The carriage moved through the gray October afternoon. The sound of the wheels on the road filled the space between them. "Margaret thinks you're trying," Anne said at last. "She told me this morning. I want you to know that her threshold for thinking well of someone is extremely high, and she has disliked you for approximately 12 years. Arthur absorbed this. "That's not entirely unwarranted." "No." The ghost of that almost smile. It isn't. What do you think? She looked at him for a long moment. I think you are trying, she said carefully. I think you are trying in a way you are not accustomed to, and that it is costing you something, and that you are paying the cost without asking for credit, which is a pause, which is new. It is new, he agreed. I am not ready to come home, she said. I want to be clear about that. Today was a good day. But a good day is not 15 years of evidence in the other direction. You understand the difference. I understand the difference. But, she stopped, looked at her hands. Come for dinner on Friday. Stay the night if the hour is late. Margaret won't object. A pause. She won't be pleasant about it, but she won't object. It was not a declaration. It was not a reconciliation. It was an invitation, careful, conditional, extended by a woman who had every right to extend nothing. Arthur Remington took it for exactly what it was. Friday, he said. She nodded once. Outside, the afternoon light was thinning toward evening, and the road back to Linfield was passing faster than it had on any previous journey. Arthur sat in the carriage across from his wife, the woman who had spent 2 weeks defeating a carefully orchestrated campaign to erase her standing, who had walked into a room full of people whose opinions had been worked against her, and walked out with 17 votes to her 4, who had accomplished all of it with nothing more than 11 years of work, written out in careful handwriting, and the dignity of a woman who understood her own worth. He had not known a month ago that she was this person. He had been married to her for 15 years, and he had not known. The carriage rolled on. He did not look away from her. He was done with not looking. 2 days later, Eleanor Whitmore's next move arrived. It came not as a letter, but as a visit to Lady Harrington of Ashwick, who was perhaps the county's most significant social arbiter after Lady Harwick herself. Lady Harrington had known Anne for years and had always been warm in her regard. She was also, as Eleanor clearly understood, the kind of woman whose opinion traveled quickly and whose disapproval could close doors that no letter could reopen. Arthur found out because Lady Harrington wrote directly to him. Her letter arrived Thursday morning, 2 days before his Friday dinner at Linfield. It was composed in the measured language of a woman who considers herself a fair person and wants to remain one, but who has heard something that has genuinely disturbed her and wants to give him the opportunity to address it before she decides what to believe. Eleanor apparently had told Lady Harrington that Anne had been managing the Remington Hall estate accounts independently for years without Arthur's knowledge. That this constituted a significant breach of trust. That the separation had not been Arthur's initiative, but a response to discovering the extent of Anne's unauthorized control of the estate finances. Arthur sat with that letter for a long time, not because it was difficult to know how to respond. He knew immediately and completely how to respond. He sat with it because the particular skill of Eleanor's move had not been lost on him. She had taken the truth, rotated it precisely 180 degrees, and presented the reverse image as the genuine article. It was elegant in the way that deeply dishonest things sometimes are. She had also, in doing it, handed him something. He wrote back to Lady Harrington that afternoon. He did not write a defense of Anne. He wrote a testimony. He explained in precise and personal terms that the management of the Remington Hall estate finances by Lady Remington had occurred with his full knowledge, that this had been the arrangement of their household throughout their marriage, that it had served the estate exceptionally well, and that the only breach of trust that had occurred at Remington Hall was the one he himself had committed against his wife. He said clearly, without oblique language, that Eleanor Whitmore's account of events was inaccurate. He sent copies to 3 other county families who were part of Lady Harrington's particular social circle. He sent a separate note to Thomas asking him to make a record that this correspondence had occurred and what had prompted it. Then he drove to Linfield. He didn't wait for Friday. He arrived in the late afternoon unannounced and found Anne in the garden again, the same garden where this had all begun, back at the start of the 2nd week. She turned when she heard the gravel. She looked at his face. "What happened?" she said. He told her about Lady Harrington. He told her what Eleanor had told her. He watched Anne's face move through the information, not with shock, because Anne was not easily shocked, but with something that looked like the recognition of a pattern she had been tracking for a long time. She's desperate, Anne said quietly. She wouldn't have tried something so direct if she weren't. She's not wrong that it could work, Arthur said. Lady Harrington is cautious. If she had heard this from two sources instead of one. She only heard it from one. Anne's voice was steady. Because you wrote to her. I wrote to her and 3 others. He looked at her steadily. I also want to tell you what I said. I don't want to tell you after the fact. I want to tell you now while there's still time to correct it if I've said something wrong. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Tell me, she said. He told her. Every word as precisely as he could remember them. When he finished, Anne was quiet for a long moment. You called it a breach of trust, she said. What you did. It was. In a letter to Lady Harrington. Yes. The wind moved across the garden. Anne's hands were still at her sides, not clenched, not tense. Still in the way of a person standing inside a significant moment and choosing very carefully what to do with it. You are making it very difficult, she said at last, to maintain the appropriate level of wariness. I'm not trying to. I know you're not trying to. And there it was, not the almost smile, not the ghost of one. A real one. Small contained the smile of a woman who does not give them easily, and has therefore not cheapened them by overuse. That's what makes it difficult. Arthur looked at her. For the first time since Thursday morning 3 weeks ago, Anne Montgomery Remington looked back at her husband, without the careful management, without the controlled distance, without the 15 years of learned self-protection standing between her face and what she was actually feeling. She was not ready to come home. She had said that, and she had meant it. But something had changed in the garden at Linfield on a gray Thursday in October. Something had shifted from possible to real, from a door left unlocked to a door just barely beginning to open. And Eleanor Whitmore, with all her patience and all her careful maneuvering, had not managed to close it. Friday dinner at Linfield became a habit neither of them named aloud. The first Friday, Arthur arrived at 6 and left at 9. Margaret served a decent meal and maintained her position of armed neutrality, speaking when spoken to and volunteering nothing beyond what courtesy required. Charles Fairfield had returned from his business travel and was genuinely pleasant. The easy, uncomplicated pleasantness of a man who has no personal stake in the conflict and simply wants everyone at his table to eat well and argue quietly. Arthur ate well. He argued with no one. He spoke to Anne about the estate not performing openness, but genuinely asking questions he had previously considered beneath his attention. What did she think about the arrangement with the Ashwick Farms now that the autumn yield was in? What was her read on the Fordham family situation going into winter? Had she ever considered formalizing the household fund as a named charitable trust, rather than a private account? Anne answered him. Directly, specifically, without the careful hedging of a woman who has learned to soften her opinions before offering them. She disagreed with him twice. He listened both times. He changed his position once, which surprised them both. Margaret watched this from the other end of the table, with the expression of someone observing a phenomenon they did not expect to find credible and are not yet certain they do. Charles refilled everyone's wine. The second Friday. Arthur arrived at 5:30 and left at 10. The conversations were longer and ranged further. Anne talked about the household fund, not just the practical details, but the origin of it, the way she had constructed it quietly over years, the names of the families who had drawn from it, and the particular circumstances of each. She had never told anyone the full scope of it. Not Thomas, not Margaret. She had held it privately for so long that telling it now had a quality of unclenching the slow, careful release of something held under pressure. Arthur listened to every name. He did not interrupt. He did not offer commentary or suggest alternate approaches. He just listened the way a man listens when he understands that the talking itself is the thing of value, not whatever he might add to it. When she finished, he said, "Thank you for telling me." She looked at him. "That's all?" A slight edge in her voice, not hostile but testing. "That's all," he said. "You built something remarkable. I didn't need to be part of it to know that." The edge softened. The third Friday, he didn't leave until well past midnight, and Margaret didn't comment on it. The letter from Eleanor Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday in November. It came to Linfield, not to Remington Hall. Addressed to Anne in Eleanor's precise handwriting. No Harwick Association letterhead. No social pleasantries. Just a single folded sheet sealed with plain wax. Anne read it once, then set it on the writing table in the small sitting room where she had been working. She sat looking at it for several minutes before calling for Margaret. Margaret read it. Her face went very still. "She's threatening you," Margaret said flatly. "She's warning me." Anne kept her voice even. "There's a version of this that she would call a warning. She says she has letters. She says she has letters." Margaret set the paper down. "What letters?" "I don't know." Anne picked up the note again. She read the relevant line one more time slowly. "I have in my possession certain correspondence that, if it were to reach the appropriate parties, might present Lady Remington's management of Remington Hall affairs in a rather different light than she has chosen to describe them. I've been trying to understand what she could possibly mean by that. Something she's fabricated. Possibly." Anne folded the letter again. "Or something she's misrepresented. She's skillful at misrepresentation, we know that." A pause. "Or something real that she's found a way to make look like something it wasn't." Margaret looked at her sister with the full force of 11 years' accumulated protective fury. "You need to tell Arthur." "I know. Today." "I know, Margaret. Not Friday, today." Margaret crossed the room, picked up Anne's light wool wrap from the chair and held it out. "I'll have the carriage brought round." Arthur was in the estate office when she arrived. Thomas was with him. They had been going over the formal documentation for the estate changes, working through the practical mechanics of putting Anne's name on the records in the precise way she had specified. There was a considerable amount of paperwork involved in undoing 15 years of omission, and they had been at it for most of the morning, when the butler, the temporary one, Arthur had hired through Thomas's recommendation, a steady, unastonished man named Howell, announced, "Lady Remington." Arthur was on his feet before the words were fully out. Anne came in and stopped. She looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at her. The look that passed between them was the look of two people who have been quietly coordinating on behalf of the same cause for 3 years and are now in the same room as the person that cause was centered on. "I'll leave you," Thomas said. He gathered his papers with unhurried efficiency, nodded to Anne with an expression that managed to be both professional and deeply relieved, and withdrew. Anne held out the letter. Arthur took it. He read it. His face as he read went through several things in quick succession: recognition, anger, and then something more controlled, more deliberate. The face of a man who has learned in the past 3 weeks that his first response is not always his most useful one. He set the letter on the desk. "How long has she had access to Remington Hall correspondence?" he asked. "She visited regularly for 18 months, Anne said. "She would have had access to the drawing room, the morning room, the library." She paused. "The library connects to the east study through an unlocked door. I always use the east study for correspondence." Arthur looked at the letter again. "She's not specific about what she has." "No. She's specific enough to be credible and vague enough to be unverifiable." Anne sat down, not with the careful propriety she had maintained through months of difficult conversations, but with the slight heaviness of someone who is genuinely tired. "She wants me to withdraw from the Harwick Association formally. She wants me to recommend her as my successor. And she wants, this is the part that took me the longest to understand, she wants me to write to Lady Harrington confirming that the account of events she gave her was essentially accurate." The room was very quiet. "She wants you to agree that you were wrong," Arthur said slowly. "She wants me to agree that she was right." Anne's voice was steady. "That I overstepped, that you acted appropriately, that the separation was warranted." A beat. "She wants me to hand her the narrative." Arthur stood up from behind the desk. He moved to the window, not looking out of it, just needing to be upright and moving while he processed this. "She's afraid," he said. "Yes." The Monday vote rattled her. The letters to Lady Harrington and the others, she didn't expect those. He turned back. "She built her position on the assumption that I would remain passive. That you would handle everything privately, and I would stay out of it. That was a reasonable assumption, Anne said carefully. Based on prior evidence. He held her gaze. Yes, it was. So what do we do? The question was genuine. Not rhetorical, not a test. She was asking. She was actually asking him with real openness what he thought they should do, and the simplicity of it. The ordinary collaborative quality of it was more significant than anything that had happened in the past 3 weeks. He came back to the desk. He sat across from her. We find out what she has, he said. Thomas needs to go through every file in the East Study and the library. Every letter, every document. Anything that could be taken out of context. He paused. And I need to think about who she's most likely to take this to if she follows through. Cecily Harwick, Anne said immediately. And the Ashwick Harringtons. Those are the 2 relationships she can't win as long as they're intact. A pause. She knows that. Then those are the 2 we protect first. He thought for a moment. I can invite Sir Edmund and Lady Harwick for dinner, here at Remington Hall. A formal dinner, something that makes clear without anything needing to be said directly that the estate is functioning and its circumstances are stable. He looked at her. But I'd need you to be there. Silence. Anne looked at the desk between them. That would mean coming to Remington Hall. He kept his voice steady. I'm not asking you to come home. I'm asking you to have dinner. As the lady of the estate, which you are, and have always been, regardless of where you're sleeping. A pause. You can leave afterward. Howell will have the carriage ready whenever you want it. She was quiet for a long moment. All right, she said at last. Dinner. Thomas spent 2 days in the East Study and the library. He was methodical as he was about everything. He went through every document, every file, every letter, cross-referencing them against Anne's correspondence records and making note of anything that existed in ambiguous form. Anything that removed from its context could be made to look like something other than what it was. He found 3 things. He brought them to Arthur on the 3rd day, and Arthur called Anne. She arrived that afternoon and sat in the estate office the first time she had been in that room since the Thursday she had read the separation papers and walked out. She did not mention this, neither did he, but he saw it register in her eyes when she came through the door, and he understood that sitting in that chair cost her something she was paying without complaint. Thomas laid the 3 documents on the desk. The first was a letter Anne had written to Mr. Fordham, the tenant farmer whose child had needed the doctor in the winter of 1816. In it, she had written, I have arranged for Dr. Whitfield's continued visits without reference to Lord Remington, as I believe this matter does not require his particular attention at this time. Taken in isolation, it read as an admission of acting behind Arthur's back. In context, it was a woman managing a medical emergency efficiently. But Eleanor, with the right framing, could make the isolation do significant damage. The second was a letter from Anne to Thomas himself, from early 1817, in which she had written, I would prefer Lord Remington not be consulted on the Ashwick arrangement at this stage, as his involvement may complicate negotiations that are currently proceeding well. Again, reasonable in context, damning in isolation. The third was not a letter. It was a page from one of Anne's personal diaries, and when Arthur saw it on the desk, he felt the particular cold of a man who understands that a line has been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. He looked at Thomas. She went through her private correspondence. Thomas's expression said everything it needed to without words. That's mine, Anne said. Her voice was completely flat. She reached across and picked up the diary page. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it face down on the desk. I kept a personal diary in the East Study. She had no right to that room and no right to that diary. No, Arthur said. She didn't. What does it say? His voice was careful. Anne looked at him for a moment. Then she turned the page over. He read it. It was dated March of 1816, over a year before the separation. Anne had written, I am so tired. I am tired in the way that I cannot explain to him, because explaining it requires him to see it, and he does not see me. I do not know how long I can continue building something for a man who looks through it as though it were glass. I love him. That has not changed. But loving someone and being invisible to them is its own kind of loneliness. And I have been lonely for a very long time. Arthur read it twice. He set it down. He did not look up immediately. He gave himself a moment not for composure. He was not in danger of losing composure, but because what he had just read deserved a moment of stillness before he responded to it. When he looked up, Anne was watching him. "I was lonely," she said quietly. "I wrote it down because I had nowhere else to put it." "I know." His voice was rougher than he intended. "I know. If she shows that to the right person, she won't." He picked up the diary page. He held it for a moment. Then he looked at Anne directly. "This belongs to you. Everything in that diary belongs to you. If Eleanor Whitmore presents this as evidence of anything other than a wife who deserved better than she received, she will find that the person it reflects most poorly on is not you. She could argue it demonstrates instability, emotional. She could argue anything." His voice was firm, not unkind. "But I will answer it. Whatever she says, wherever she says it, I will answer it with the truth. The truth is on that page. Anyone who reads it clearly will see exactly whose failure it records." He paused. "Let her show it. Let her show all three." Anne looked at him for a long moment. "You understand what you're saying," she said. "You're saying you'll publicly acknowledge that this is your failure." "It is my failure. In front of the Harwicks, the Harringtons, the association." "Yes." "Arthur." Her voice shifted, not softer exactly, but more direct, more unguarded than he'd heard her in weeks. "That will cost you significantly. Men of your position do not—" "Men of my position," he said, signed separation papers and handed them to the women who were holding their households together because they were too proud to admit they'd been wrong. And then they spent 3 weeks in an empty house, learning the price of that particular arrogance. He looked at her steadily. "I know what it will cost. I've decided it's worth it." The room was very still. Thomas, who had the discretion of a man who has learned that some silences are not his to fill, looked at the wall and said nothing. Anne's hands were folded on the desk in front of her. He could see the effort in them, not tension, but the conscious stilling of something that wanted to move. "The dinner," she said finally. "When do you want to hold it?" The dinner was set for the following Friday. Howell proved to be a remarkable temporary butler, the kind of man who understood instinctively what was required without needing to be told twice. He coordinated with the temporary cook, arranged for additional kitchen help from the village, and presented Arthur with a proposed dinner schedule and seating arrangement without being asked. Arthur looked at the seating arrangement. He moved 2 names and handed it back. Howell took it without comment. Arthur was beginning to think significantly superior to his predecessor. Mrs. Hadley arrived on Wednesday. Not the full staff, just her. She came to the tradesman's entrance at 9 in the morning with a traveling bag and a look of concentrated purpose, and told Howell she was there to ensure the house was in appropriate order for Friday's dinner. Howell, who had been managing alone for 3 weeks and knew the value of expertise when it arrived, showed her everything she needed to see. Arthur found out when he came down for breakfast and found the morning room properly set for the first time in a month. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the set table, the properly drawn curtains, the fire that had been laid correctly and was burning as it should. He went to find Mrs. Hadley. She was in the linen cupboard taking an inventory with the focused efficiency of a woman who has found 3 weeks of absence has not improved the organization of things. "Mrs. Hadley." She turned, looked at him without particular expression. "Ma'am." He didn't know why he said it. He had never called her that. It simply came out, the instinctive acknowledgement of someone who has done something significant and is being recognized for it. "Thank you." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the linen cupboard. "The good tablecloths need pressing," she said, "and the silver on the west sideboard hasn't been polished in a month. I'll have them done by Thursday." He left her to it. He walked back to the estate office and sat down and spent a full minute simply being grateful for her. Anne arrived at Remington Hall on Friday afternoon. She came 3 hours before the guests early enough to walk through the house to reacquaint herself with the rooms she had managed for 15 years, to see what had changed and what hadn't. Arthur gave her the full 3 hours. He did not follow her through the house or explain things or offer commentary. He let her move through it at her own pace in her own way, while he stayed in the estate office and reviewed documents he had already reviewed twice. At one point, he heard her voice in the corridor speaking to Mrs. Hadley. He couldn't make out the words, just the tone. The warm, easy tone of two women who have worked alongside each other for years and have not lost the thread of that. He stayed in the office. The guests arrived at 7. Sir Edmund and Lady Cecily Harwick, Lord and Lady Harrington from Ashwick, two other county families whose loyalty was important, and whose presence at Remington Hall that evening would itself communicate something that no letter could convey. Anne received them in the entrance hall. She stood beside Arthur, not behind him, not slightly to the side, as she had been positioned at formal occasions throughout their marriage. Beside him. Equal in the architecture of the greeting, equal in the way the evening was arranged, equal in every visible and structural way. This was not an accident. They had discussed it briefly and precisely 2 days earlier. Arthur had asked how she wanted to handle it. She had told him. He had agreed. She wore deep green. She wore her mother's pearls. She shook hands and smiled and said names correctly and asked after children and remembered details about the last occasion each family had attended Remington Hall. She moved through the pre-dinner hour with the ease of a woman in her own house, because it was her own house, and she was no longer pretending otherwise. Arthur watched her. He watched her the way he should have been watching her for 15 years, with attention, with recognition, with the specific pleasure of a man who has finally understood what he has been looking at. Sir Edmund caught him watching. The old man said nothing, but he looked at Arthur with an expression that was for Sir Edmund Harwick relatively close to approval. The dinner was excellent. Lady Cecily, who had known Anne for 11 years and had been watching the evening carefully, found a moment between the main course and the pudding to speak quietly to Arthur, while Anne was deep in conversation with Lord Harrington's wife. "I will tell you something, Mr. Remington." Lady Cecily's voice was low and direct. She was not a woman who wasted words on pleasantries when she had something worth saying. "I have attended a great many dinners in this county. I have watched a great many marriages conduct themselves across dining tables. And I have rarely seen a man look at his wife the way you have been looking at yours this evening." Arthur looked at her. "That is either a very good thing," she continued, "or it is too late for it to matter. I sincerely hope it is the former." She lifted her wineglass. "She has deserved that look for a very long time." She moved away before he could respond. He sat with that for the remainder of the dinner. The guests left at 10:30. Howell managed the departures with smooth efficiency. Mrs. Hadley had already withdrawn. The house settled into the particular quiet of an evening successfully concluded. The good quiet. The quiet that meant something had been done properly, rather than the terrible silence of the past month. Anne stood in the entrance hall after the last carriage had gone. She looked around the hall at the familiar proportions of the room she had entered as a new bride 15 years ago, had moved through every day since, and had walked out of 4 weeks ago without looking back. "The house looks well," she said. "Mrs. Hadley came back Wednesday," Arthur said. "I didn't ask her to. She simply came." Anne's expression moved through something private and warm. "That sounds like her. She polished the west sideboard silver herself. Told Howell the footman hadn't done it to her standards. She's been saying that about footmen for 20 years. The almost smile. The footmen are never wrong, by the way. Her standards simply exist at an altitude most people cannot access. They stood in the entrance hall, the same entrance hall that had been empty and echoing and wrong 4 weeks ago, and talked the way two people talk when they are in the same place for the first time in a long time, and neither of them is quite ready for it to end. Then Anne said, "The diary page." He had wondered when they would return to it. "Yes," he said. "I want you to understand something." She turned to face him fully. "Not what I wrote, what I didn't write." A pause. "I didn't write that I wanted to leave. I didn't write that I stopped loving this house or the work of it or—" She stopped, looked at the floor. "I wrote that I was lonely. I was. But lonely people don't always want to leave. Sometimes they want the person they're lonely with to finally look up." The entrance hall was very still. Arthur looked at his wife. Really looked at her, the way Lady Cecily had noticed him doing across the dinner table, and he said, "I'm looking up." Anne met his eyes. For a moment she simply held his gaze, and he let her see whatever was in his, all of it. The regret and the genuine change, and the thing that had been underneath both of those from the beginning, which had never actually left, which he had simply stopped acknowledging because he'd stopped paying attention. "I know," she said quietly. "I can see that." "Then come home." He said it simply, without pressure, without urgency, without the weight of a man who needs an answer for his own sake. Not because you have to, not because Eleanor is still out there, or because the association needs a Remington Hall representative, or because the estate runs better when you're in it. He paused. "Come home because you want to. And if you don't want to yet, then don't. I'll be here." The silence that followed was the longest of the evening. Anne looked at the staircase. She looked at the entrance hall around her. She looked at Arthur. "Eleanor's next move is coming," she said. "Probably. We don't know what she'll try." "No. It might be worse than what she's already done." "It might be." He held her gaze. "I'll be here for that too." She was quiet for another moment. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a woman who makes decisions slowly and means them completely, when she does, "I'm not unpacking tonight." "All right. My things are still at Linfield." "I know. But—" A breath. "I'll stay tonight." She looked at him steadily. "In the East Room. My room." He nodded once. Precisely. The nod of a man who understands the gift he has just been given and is not going to diminish it by reacting too broadly. "I'll have Howell bring up tea," he said. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she moved toward the staircase, toward the stairs of her own house, the house she had built and maintained and quietly loved for 15 years. She paused at the first step. She didn't turn around. "Arthur?" Her voice was quiet, even. But it had something in it, something underneath the evenness that he had been slowly learning to hear. "Reckon there's a great deal still to be sorted out between us." He looked at her back, at the straight certain line of her shoulders. "Yes," he said. "There is." "We'll talk in the morning." "We'll talk in the morning," he agreed. She went up the stairs. He stood in the entrance hall and listened to her footsteps' familiar, unhurried, purposeful move along the corridor above him. He stood there until the sound stopped. Then he walked back to the estate office, sat down at the desk that still held 3 weeks of his reckoning, and pressed his hands flat on the surface of it, feeling the solidity of the wood, the realness of the room, the particular weight of an evening that had changed something without announcing it. The house was quiet, but it was the right quiet now, the quiet of a place that had remembered how to breathe. He sat in it for a long time. He did not feel like a man who had won something. He felt like a man who had been given a second chance that he had not earned and intended not to waste. Outside, Eleanor Whitmore's next move was still waiting in the dark, somewhere patient and unspent. It would come. But tonight, Anne Montgomery Remington was sleeping in her own house. And tomorrow they would talk. That was enough. For the first time in a very long time, that was more than enough. They talked in the morning, not immediately. Anne came down at 8:30, which was later than her usual hour, and Arthur understood without being told that she had needed the extra time. He had been up since 6. He had laid the fire in the morning room himself, better than the first time, but still imperfectly, and when Mrs. Hadley arrived at 7 and found it already burning, she had looked at it with the expression of a woman reassessing a situation. She did not relay her breakfast to him until he asked for it, which was also, he suspected, a form of assessment. When Anne came into the morning room, the table was properly set. The fire was adequate. The tea was hot. She looked at all of this, and then she looked at him, and something in her expression settled slightly, the way a person settles when they have been bracing for something and found it unnecessary. She sat down. She poured her own tea. She wrapped both hands around the cup the way she always had on cold mornings. A small private habit he had not noticed for years and was noticing now with the particular attention of a man who has decided to stop sleepwalking through his own life. "Eleanor's letter," she said. "I want to decide what to do about it before it decides for us." He nodded. "I've been thinking about it since 5 this morning." "What did you arrive at?" "We answer it together." He held her gaze. "Not separately. Not me on your behalf or you managing it quietly without me. Together. She writes to you, we respond as Remington Hall. Both names, both signatures." Anne considered this. She turned the teacup in her hands. "She'll interpret that as weakness," she said. "Two people defending one position looks like a household that functions as one." His voice was steady. "Which is what we are, or what we're becoming." A pause. "Let her interpret it however she likes. The people whose opinions matter will read it correctly." Anne looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "Together." That single word "together" landed in the morning room with a weight neither of them acknowledged directly. They simply moved forward into the practical business of what needed to be done, the way people move forward when the significant thing has already been said, and both of them know it. The response to Eleanor's letter took 2 hours to draft. They worked at the writing table in the East Study. Anne's study, the room she had managed from for 15 years, the room Eleanor had entered without invitation and taken from like a thief. Anne sat at the desk. Arthur took the chair across from her. They went through every clause of Eleanor's threat and addressed it with the directness of two people who have decided they are done being careful about things that do not deserve care. They named the diary page, not the contents, just the fact of it. The fact that Eleanor Whitmore had accessed private correspondence that did not belong to her from a room she had no authorization to enter and had used it as a threat. They stated clearly that this would be reported to Sir Edmund Harwick, to Lady Harrington, and to any other party Eleanor intended to approach. They stated that the 3 letters Eleanor held, the ones about the Fordham arrangement and the Ashwick negotiations, were being voluntarily disclosed to Thomas Bennet for formal estate record-keeping with full contextual annotation. There would be no version of events in which those letters appeared damning, because the complete version of events would already be on record. And then Anne wrote the final paragraph herself while Arthur watched. She wrote Mrs. Whitmore, "You have spent considerable time and effort attempting to rewrite the record of this household. I would invite you to consider that the record was always complete. You simply did not have access to all of it. You now do. I trust you will find it instructive." Arthur read it. "Leave it exactly as it is," he said. Anne signed it first. Then Arthur signed beneath her name, not above, not beside, but beneath, in the deliberate positioning of a man who understood the statement it made. Thomas delivered it that afternoon. Eleanor Whitmore's response came 4 days later. It was brief. It was composed with her usual surface-level courtesy. It said essentially nothing, which was itself a statement. A woman who had nothing left to deploy did not need many words to signal her retreat. Thomas read it, summarized it, and set the summary on the desk between them with the expression of a man who has been watching a long chess game reach its conclusion. "She's withdrawing," Arthur said. "From the immediate position, yes." Thomas was careful as always with his assessments. "Whether she withdraws entirely or simply waits for a different moment, that I cannot say. She'll wait," Anne said from across the room. She was standing at the window of the estate office, her arms crossed loosely, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "That's who she is. She's patient. She'll look for another angle eventually." A pause. "But she's lost the primary ones. The Harwick position is secure. The county relationships are intact. Whatever she tells people now, there's a counter record that's been formally established and widely enough known that her version can't stand alone." She turned from the window. "She needed us to be divided. We're not divided." Thomas nodded. He gathered his papers. At the door he stopped the same way he had stopped on that first terrible Friday 4 weeks ago, when Arthur had sent him away from the estate office. He turned around. My lord. He looked between the two of them. My lady. The second address was given with a formality that was entirely genuine, not deference to rank, but recognition of something restored. It has been a privilege to serve this estate. I want you both to know that. He left. Anne looked at the door after it closed. He's been loyal to this house for 3 years, she said quietly. To both of us. Even when that was a complicated thing to be. I know. Arthur looked at her. I'll tell him so properly. He deserves more than my good opinion, he deserves a record of it. Anne turned to look at him, and she smiled, not the almost smile, not the ghost of one. A real one, full and unhurried, the smile of a woman who is genuinely, uncomplicatedly pleased. He had not seen that smile directed at him in so long that it took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. He felt it land somewhere deep in his chest and stay there. Anne's things arrived from Linfield on a Tuesday. She had not made an announcement. She had not consulted Arthur about the timing, though she had told him the day before, simply directly the way she told him things now. I'm having my things brought back tomorrow. And he had nodded. And that had been that. Margaret came with the belongings. She supervised the transfer of boxes and trunks with the fierce attention of a woman who has spent 6 weeks caring for her sister and is not entirely certain she is ready to stop. She directed the footmen in a manner that suggested she found their technique inadequate. She inspected the east bedroom with the thoroughness of a building assessor. Arthur stayed out of her way entirely. At midday, he found her in the corridor outside the east bedroom. Arms crossed, examining the wall with a look that he could not immediately decode. Mrs. Fairfield. She turned, looked at him the way she had always looked at him, but something in the look had shifted. Not warmth, not yet. Something more like the careful beginning of a revised assessment. The wallpaper in this corridor, she said, has needed replacing for at least 4 years. He looked at the wallpaper. You're right. Anne mentioned it in the autumn of 1814, and again in 1815. She looked back at the wall. She stopped mentioning it after that. I'll have it replaced, he said. This week. She can choose the pattern. Margaret looked at him for another moment. She chose you, she said bluntly. 15 years ago, over 2 other offers that were frankly more straightforward propositions. She chose you because she thought you were worth the complication. A pause. I told her she was wrong. I want you to know that. I told her so plainly, and she told me that she knew what she was doing, and for many years I believed she had been mistaken. A beat. I am revising that assessment, slowly, with conditions. I'll take it, Arthur said. You should. She uncrossed her arms. The wallpaper first. She walked past him down the corridor and descended the stairs to the entrance hall, where she collected her things with brisk efficiency. Kissed Anne at the door, with the fierce tenderness of a woman who loves her sister without any of the complications of pretending otherwise, and departed for Linfield in the Fairfield carriage. Arthur stood at the entrance hall doorway and watched the carriage go, behind him. Anne said, She likes you now. She'll never admit it, but she does. He turned. She was standing in the middle of the entrance hall, her house, with her arms loose at her sides, and that real smile still living somewhere near her expression. How can you tell? He asked. She gave you instructions about the wallpaper. She moved past him toward the morning room. When she genuinely dislikes someone, she simply doesn't bother. The formal documentation was completed on a Thursday in December. Thomas came to Remington Hall with the finalized papers. The estate records amended the household accounts properly attributed the legal notation of Anne's authority over household and tenant management, written into the official documents of Remington Hall for the first time in 15 years. It was not a ceremony. There was no audience. It was 3 people in an estate office on a gray December morning, going through papers that should have been drawn up 15 years earlier and were being drawn up now. Thomas walked them through each document. Anne asked 2 questions. Arthur signed wherever Thomas indicated. Anne signed beside him, not beneath him this time, not above. Beside. When it was done, Thomas gathered the signed copies with the unhurried precision of a man who has been working toward this particular stack of papers for longer than anyone had formally asked him to. "There's one more thing," he said. He produced a single additional document, smaller than the others, a brief notation formally worded that he had clearly drafted separately from the estate paperwork. Arthur read it. It was a formal record. Thomas's own professional record, entered into his solicitor's files, attesting that the contributions of Lady Anne Montgomery Remington to the Remington Hall estate from the years 1802 through 1817 had been material essential and of a nature consistent with full co-management of the property. It was signed by Thomas. It was dated that day. "This is my professional record," Thomas said quietly. "Not the estate's, mine. It will remain in my files regardless of any future change in circumstances." He looked at Anne. "I should have found a way to do this years ago. I want you to know that I understood even when I was not in a position to say so plainly exactly what this estate owed you." Anne looked at the document. She looked at it for a long moment. "Thomas." Her voice was steady, but only in the way of someone who has decided firmly that it will be. "Thank you." He nodded once, the nod of a man who has done a thing he believes in and does not need further acknowledgement for it, and excused himself. Arthur and Anne sat alone in the estate office. Outside, December was doing what December did. Inside, the fire burned properly. It had been burning properly since Mrs. Hadley's return, and Arthur had stopped trying to lay it himself, which Mrs. Hadley had made clear was the correct decision. 15 years, Anne said quietly. She was looking at the signed documents on the desk. 15 years, he agreed. We wasted a great deal of time. We did. She picked up Thomas's separate document, the personal attestation, and held it for a moment. I didn't do any of it for recognition, she said. Not defensively. Just plainly because it was true, and she wanted it stated clearly. I want you to know that. The household fund, the tenant arrangements, the harvest management. I didn't do it because I needed to be seen doing it. I know. I did it because it needed doing, and I could do it. I know that too. He leaned forward slightly. But it needed to be seen. Not because you required the credit. Because the people who come after us, whoever manages this estate in 50 years, they need to know that this is how it worked. That it was built by two people, not one. He paused. The omission was a lie. A lie by absence, but a lie. And lies have consequences. Anne set Thomas's document down. She folded her hands. Eleanor, she said. Not as a warning, as a thought arriving. What about her? I want to say something about her that I haven't said yet. She looked at him steadily. She didn't create the problem between us. She found it. There's a difference. A pause. She found a gap, a real gap, one that was already there, and she moved into it. She couldn't have done what she did if there hadn't been a gap to move into. I know. His voice was quiet. That's the part I'll spend the longest carrying. I don't say it to make you carry it. She held his gaze. I say it because understanding it is the only way to make sure it doesn't happen again. A beat. There can't be gaps she can move into, or anyone else. The only way to close them is to actually share this, really share it. Not as a concession, not as something you grant me, as the way the house works. That's what I want, he said. That's what I'm asking for the chance to do. Then we're agreed. The December morning sat quietly around them. There's something else, Anne said. He waited. The household fund. She squared her shoulders slightly, the small, unconscious adjustment of a woman about to say something she has been carrying for a while. I want to formalize it. The way you suggested in October, a named charitable trust properly documented with a formal board of oversight. She paused. I want the Fordham family's name attached to it, in memory of their youngest child who recovered, but who nearly didn't. Another pause. And I want it to be publicly associated with Remington Hall, not hidden, not a private arrangement. She looked at him. It should have always been public. I hid it because I was afraid you'd put a stop to it. I'm not hiding things anymore. Arthur looked at his wife. He thought about the March 1816 diary entry he had read in the estate office 3 weeks ago. I love him. That has not changed. He thought about the woman who had written that alone in the East Study, managing an estate and a household, and a dozen families who depended on her invisible inside the life of a man who had been looking through her as though she were glass. I thought about how close it had come. How close he had come to losing everything that mattered, not the estate, not the name, not the standing in the county, but her. This woman. This specific, remarkable, irreplaceable woman who had spent 15 years being extraordinary in silence. "The Fordham Trust," he said. "We'll have Thomas draw it up before Christmas." She nodded. Then she said something he did not expect. "I forgive you." Just that. Direct and plain in the way she said things when she meant them completely. He went very still. "Not because what happened is acceptable," she continued. "Not because the 15 years didn't cost me something real, but because I know who you're trying to become, and I believe you. And carrying unforgiveness for the rest of our lives would cost me more than it would cost you." She looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "I choose not to pay that price." Arthur Remington looked at his wife. Really looked at her, the way he had been learning to look at her, with the full attention she had always deserved, and he did not have words for what he felt in that moment that were adequate to the feeling. So he said the truest thing he knew. "I don't deserve that." "No," she agreed simply. "But I'm giving it to you anyway. That's what choosing to give something means." She stood. "Now, the wallpaper in the east corridor needs replacing. I've been looking at samples and I have opinions." He stood too. "Margaret told me to let you choose." "Margaret tells everyone to let me choose everything. She's been doing it since we were children." She moved toward the door of the estate office, her office now properly on paper, in record, in practice. "She's usually right." The Harwick Association's Winter Charity Assembly was held in mid-December. Anne chaired it. She had chaired it for 4 years. She chaired it the same way she always had, efficiently, warmly, with the specific competence of a woman who has done a thing so long she has forgotten it was ever difficult. Arthur attended. He had never attended before. It was not the kind of event he had considered worth his time. He had always considered himself too busy, or the occasion too minor, and this was the one he could not quite look at directly, now that he understood himself better. It had been Anne's event, and attending would have required acknowledging that Anne had events worth attending. He sat beside her at the head table. Lady Cecily Harwick, who was seated to his right, leaned over at one point during the evening and said in the private tone of a woman who has been watching closely, "You're here." "I'm here," he said. "She looks different," Lady Cecily said. "When she speaks. When she moves through the room." A pause. "She looks like a woman who knows someone is watching and is glad of it." He looked down the table at Anne, who was in conversation with 2 association members about the winter distribution of the charity fund. She was animated, genuinely animated, the way she was when she talked about work she cared about. Her hands moved slightly when she spoke. She laughed at something one of them said. She glanced up and found his eyes. She didn't look away. Neither did he. It lasted only a moment. Then she returned to her conversation. But in that moment, something passed between them that required no words. The recognition of 2 people who have been through something hard together and have come out the other side of it changed, and who understand, looking at each other across a table, that the change is real. Christmas at Remington Hall was the fullest it had been in 15 years. Mrs. Hadley's staff had returned not all at once, but over the weeks since November, one by one, in the quiet and unremarkable way that people return to places they consider home when the reason for leaving has been addressed. James, the stable hand, came back first within a week of Anne's return, with the uncomplicated directness of someone 20 years old, who makes decisions based on what matters rather than what is complicated. Roberts, the footman, came back the following week with more dignity, but no less sincerity. The housemaids returned in pairs, and Mrs. Hargrove, the cook, came back on a Tuesday, and simply walked into the kitchen and started work without speaking to anyone about it, which was exactly the kind of statement Mrs. Hargrove was known for. Howell stayed on. Arthur had asked him to. He was too good to lose, simply because the crisis that had required his abilities had passed. The house at Christmas was warm and loud, and full of the sounds of a household functioning as it was meant to. Meals prepared, fires laid, corridors busy. The low, constant hum of a large house, well managed and well loved. On Christmas Eve, after the household had settled and the fires had burned low, Arthur found Anne in the east study. She was at her writing desk, the same cracked leather chair she had refused to replace for 15 years. The same desk where he had placed the separation papers on a Thursday in October and changed the course of everything. She was writing letters. Christmas correspondence from the look of it. There was a stack already sealed and addressed beside her. She did not look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was writing. Then she set her pen down and looked at him. "There's something I want to give you," he said. He held out a small flat box. She looked at it. She looked at him. She took it. Inside was a key. An old key, brass heavier than it looked. She turned it over in her hand. "The estate office," he said. "There's a secondary lock on the main document cabinet, the one that holds the original deed and the formal estate papers. It's always been a single key lock. Thomas had the locksmith fit a second barrel last week." He paused. "That's your key. Not a copy of mine. Its own key. The cabinet cannot be opened without both." Anne looked at the key in her palm. A key that made the document cabinet inaccessible to one person alone. A key that required her presence for the most significant documents of the Remington estate to be accessed at all. A key that was not symbolic. It was mechanical, physical, real. The most literal version of what he had been trying to say for 2 months. She closed her hand around it. When she looked up at him, her eyes were bright in the way of a woman who does not cry easily and is not going to cry now, but is close enough to it that the brightness shows. "You had this made before I came home," she said. 3 weeks before. "You didn't know I was coming back." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He held her gaze. "But I knew what I wanted the house to be, whether you came back or not. I wanted it to be a house that couldn't function without you at its center. Not because you have no choice but to be there, but because the structure itself acknowledges what you are." He paused. "The key was for whenever you were ready, even if that had been years." Anne looked at him for a long moment. She stood up from the cracked leather chair. She crossed the room and she put her arms around her husband. Not carefully, not with the measured caution of the past 2 months, but fully the way a woman holds someone when she has decided that holding back costs more than it protects. He held her back. They stood in the east study on Christmas Eve, the same room where it had all broken, the same room where so much of what mattered had been built in quiet and silence over 15 years, and they held each other in the warm, uncomplicated way of two people who have fought their way back to something real. After a long moment, Anne said into his shoulder, "The chair needs replacing." He laughed, actually laughed, the full and genuine kind he had not managed in months. "I've been saying that for 3 years." "You were right." She pulled back, looked at him. "Don't make it a habit." The Fordham Trust was formally established in January of 1818. Thomas drew up the documents with the careful thoroughness he applied to everything. The trust was named in full, the Fordham Remington Charitable Trust, for the relief of tenant families and household workers in need of medical and material assistance. Annie was named as its founding administrator. Arthur was named as co-trustee. The initial endowment came jointly from Anne's personal inheritance, what remained of it after years of quiet private expenditure, and from the Remington estate accounts formally and publicly. The announcement went to the Harwick Association. It went to Lady Harrington. It went to every county family of standing within 3 counties. It went by Anne's deliberate choice to the 7 families who had been helped by the private household fund over the years, not as a notification, but as a personal letter written by Anne herself, acknowledging what had existed privately and making it public. The response from the county was significant. Lady Cecily wrote immediately and asked to be listed as a patron. Lord and Lady Harrington followed within the week. By the end of January, the Fordham Remington Trust had 17 county families attached to it as patrons and a waiting list of 3 more. Eleanor Whitmore made no further moves. She was not discussed at Remington Hall. She was not a subject of correspondence or strategy or concern. She simply became, over the course of that winter, someone who had passed through their lives and left, and whose absence the house did not feel. In the spring of 1818, Anne wrote to Margaret, not about the trust, not about the estate, not about Arthur. She wrote about the garden at Remington Hall, which was coming into its season, and about a particular variety of rose she had been attempting to establish for 3 years that had finally that April produced its first blooms. She wrote, I told you when I left that I did not know whether the house would be worth returning to. I want you to tell me I was right to try. Not because I need the permission, but because you are the person whose opinion I trust most in the world, and because the truth is, I am happy, Margaret. Genuinely and without qualification, happy in a way I am not certain I have been before. He sees me now. Every day he sees me. And it turns out, that is the thing I needed most, and the thing that changes everything. Margaret's reply came 4 days later. It was one sentence. You were right to try, and I was wrong about him, and I will deny having written this if you ever show it to anyone. Anne read it in the East Study, and laughed so hard, Mrs. Hadley came to the door to investigate. She pinned it to the inside of the document cabinet, right beside her key. Years later, when people spoke of Remington Hall, and people did speak of it with the particular warmth reserved for places that have earned their reputation. Honestly, they spoke of the Fordham Remington Trust, which had by then helped hundreds of families across 3 counties. They spoke of the household that ran with a kind of considered efficiency that other estates attempted to replicate and somehow never quite managed. They spoke of Anne Montgomery Remington, whose name appeared on every significant document the estate had produced since 1817, and of the woman herself, steady, direct, warm in the specific way of someone who has chosen warmth rather than stumbled into it. They spoke less often of what had happened in October of 1817. Those who knew the story told it carefully because it was not a simple story. It was not a story about a villain or a hero or a clean redemption. It was a story about a man who had everything he needed and looked through it for 15 years and what it cost to finally learn to see, and a woman who had spent those 15 years building something beautiful in the space of that blindness and who had ultimately chosen to let the person responsible for it become part of it. What endured at Remington Hall was not the name on the deed. It was not the acres or the standing or the formal record of the estate's holdings. What endured was this: a woman had loved something enough to build it in silence, and a man had finally understood that love is not a thing you receive, it is a thing you earn day by choosing to see the person standing right in front of you. Arthur Remington learned that. He learned it late, and at a cost that had no fully satisfactory accounting. But he learned it. And Anne Montgomery Remington, who had always known her own worth, even when no one else was willing to acknowledge it, had chosen deliberately, clear-eyed, without illusion, to let that learning mean something. She had returned to Remington Hall not because she had to, not because she had nowhere else to go, not because the world had given her no better option. She had returned because she looked at the man her husband was becoming, and she decided that the life they could build together, honestly, equally, with both their names on every document that mattered, was worth more than the life she would build without him. That was her choice, and it was the most powerful thing she ever did.